Welcome back, everyone, to our next keynote and fireside chat with the Honourable George Heyman, Minister of Environment and Climate Change Strategy in British Columbia. Minister Heyman was first elected as the MLA for Vancouver Fairview in 2013. And many of you will know that since 2017, he served as the Minister of Environment and Climate Change Strategy, something that's clearly near and dear to what we do here at QTRIC. Also, really importantly, in 2020, Minister Heyman became the minister responsible for Translink. And of course, we say that's really important because Translink is one of our founding members, sits on our board, and we have these ongoing electric bus projects with Translink. I consider Translink to be one of the real innovative leaders in public transit across Canada. So it's great to have the ministerial voice for Translink here today with us in terms of your past experience, your current experience, and all the great work you're doing, Mr. Heyman. I also want to note, and I think for the last couple of years, I've noted this, you've done a great job joining us for these conferences during the pandemic in this digital era. And I've mentioned this before, that Minister Heyman was the executive director of the Sierra Club in British Columbia, but I like to re-mention it because it really does indicate the importance of environmentalists moving into the political sphere and moving into the domain of decision-making. So as a result of that, not surprisingly, many folks will know on the line if they're out in the West Coast that Mr. Heyman took on a major role in creating the Clean BC plan, something that has very much focused on reducing air pollution, creating more jobs, and creating economic opportunities in the green economy, something that QTRIC has been set up to try to motivate and innovate as well across the country. So Minister Heyman, thank you once again for your time and your commitment to the industry, to the economy, to the community in terms of green mobility and then just environmentalism overall. I want to pass the digital microphone over to you for some of your introductory comments, and then we have a series of questions that we want to get into with you to gain a little bit more insight into what's happening on the West Coast.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Josipa. And I want to begin by acknowledging that I'm joining you from the traditional territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh peoples. I'm in Vancouver. And could there be a more important time other than next year to talk about the steps that we all need to take to decarbonize transportation as part of addressing the climate challenge? I'm really pleased and excited to be invited again to speak with you and with people at QTRIC about the exciting progress being made on zero emissions public transit. You mentioned Translink being a founding member of QTRIC, and QTRIC in turn has been a great supporter of BC's transition through your partnership with Translink. And I agree with you. I think Translink is a leader in public transit in North America and an innovator. And that's going to be critically important going forward. So for the next minute or two, I'm probably going to tell you things that you already know very well. But all of the recent UN reports, including the most recent one, clearly show the need for greater ambition in climate action, whether it's adaptation or mitigation. They're both critically important going forward. And in BC, if people weren't already aware that climate change wasn't something that would be experienced in the future, but something that is impacting us severely today, they certainly learned from extreme flooding, deadly heat waves, severe wildfires. It had an ongoing impact on British Columbia and British Columbians. And we're seeing the world beginning to respond. Many of us would have wished more decisive action earlier, but clearly, whether it is the actions of governments, the action of industry, or the action of investors, or decisions and progress being made at international conferences like COP, people are recognizing the immense challenge. There are actions underway, notwithstanding the fact that there is so much more to do. I mentioned the investment community, which is incorporating, in many cases, a requirement to see as in, show me your plan to reduce carbon emissions, show me your plan to get to net zero by 2050, and how it will be staged in over time before we consider putting our money into your company, because we know as investors that climate action is important and that companies that are not paying attention to reducing emissions and being part of the climate solution are going to have problems. This is often expressed as environmental, social, and governance principles, but really it's simply dealing with the economic reality of the impacts that climate change is having at every level of society and the economy. So we're seeing the net zero ambitions and objectives. And in British Columbia, as you mentioned, we have our Clean BC plan introduced in 2018. And recently, at the end of 2021, we introduced our Clean BC roadmap to 2030 that set out how we were going to close the remaining gap to achieve our legislated climate targets. It set out integrated plans across a number of pathways. We launched it just prior to COP26, and where we saw existing actions where more ambition was warranted because we were being successful, we moved to accelerate those actions. Where we saw areas where we needed more ambition or where we needed new action, we introduced those in the plan. So some of the ambitious goals are shifting from personal vehicles to active transportation and transit, a 30% shift by 2030. We are working to transform our public transit fleet to net zero. That's a critical part of our solution. And as you mentioned, my mandate includes responsibility for Translink, which is the regional transportation authority for Metro Vancouver. And in this role, we have many commitments to improve and expand public transit, including improving access to transit options for people in Metro Vancouver by accelerating construction of major rapid transit lines, such as the SkyTrain service that will extend up the Fraser Valley to Langley, reducing the gridlock of single occupancy vehicles stretching to Vancouver. We're expanding SkyTrain service along the Broadway corridor, and while no final investment or business plan decision has been made, we all know, I think, that the goal is ultimately to extend the line all the way out to the west end of the city out at UBC. We established free transit for youth 12 and under, creating lifelong transit users by ensuring that young people and their families have no inhibition to putting young people on transit at an early age. And we're accelerating the transition to net zero emission bus fleets, both Translink and throughout the rest of the province through BC Transit, through electrification, hydrogen, and other technologies. QTRIC's focus is quite central to our work in British Columbia. You continue to support decarbonized transit in British Columbia in partnership with Translink through the e-bus and charger pilot. There are 4 battery electric buses and 2 chargers that have been in service since 2019. And Translink has ordered 15 more e-buses from Novabus to add to the pilot this year to more than quadruple the current fleet size. QTRIC helps by evaluating the performance and interoperability of the buses and our charging infrastructure. And this will inform the implementation of Translink's ambitious climate action strategy, in which the province is a senior partner. And of course, we fully support it. Both Translink and BC Transit have ambitious plans to decarbonize their bus fleets by 2040. And BC Transit's first 10 battery electric buses are expected in Victoria later this year. 240 compressed natural gas buses are bridging the transition to electric. Currently, while Translink has 4 e-buses, there are 262 electric trolley buses and a fully electric SkyTrain system, supported by 299 CNG buses, which will use only renewable natural gas by 2024 as we work hard to accelerate the transition to truly zero-emission transportation. In conclusion, we have incredible potential to learn from each other to better address the climate crisis through collaboration, through testing new technology, and finding new approaches. And as global markets change and as technology improves, what we do as policymakers really makes a difference. That's why I'm so excited that we have a credible plan in Clean BC and we're measuring ourselves against it. So we can build a cleaner and stronger future for everyone, a safer future for our kids and grandkids, and we can do it together. Thanks.
Those are great words, Minister Heyman. And I'm going to build right on to what you just said about planning. But before we do, I want to go back to the point you made about the free transit for young people. I'm a huge believer in that. I really do believe if we get young people into transit early on, it's like newspaper subscriptions. If you start reading newspaper young, then you know you're always going to read a newspaper into your life. It's a great thing. And there was a project out in Kingston in Ontario a while ago. I think it's a project that we should try and get going across Canada, but it's not just free transit for young people. It's that school trips are on transit buses rather than necessarily school buses. They're on transit buses. And the whole idea is that you're getting kids into public transit, so they're not scared of it. And, you know, I think as Canadians, we often think, oh, transit's not convenient, but actually people are just scared because they don't know. They don't know where the stops are. They don't know where they're going to get off. They don't use the system. So I love the fact that you're getting young people on there because young people aren't scared, and then they won't be scared adults, and it'll be just a natural part of their DNA. So congratulations to you for that. Hopefully we can expand that across the country. Having said that, now going to the planning part, and that is part of the plan, getting young people into transit and promoting transit. But the big plan that you referred to is, of course, BC's 2030 plan and that roadmap toward the 2050 net zero commitment. It's a pretty critical roadmap. As Canadians, though, we've been given lots of roadmaps, and a lot of the times they're just reports that go on a shelf and don't go anywhere. So can you walk us through why this roadmap is so critical for the province, and really what the accountability measures are that your government and you yourself would use to say, yeah, actually, it's not just a report on the shelf. This roadmap had teeth and it made action and it resulted in emissions reduction?
Great question. And I agree with you. And that's partly what informed the design, not just of our Clean BC plan and our roadmap, but of our Climate Change Accountability Act. So first of all, while the roadmap to 2030 also incorporates the measures that will get us to our targets of 2040 and net zero by 2050, it is important, I think, for all of us to recognize that a statement or a commitment to be net zero by 2050 just isn't enough, because whenever we hit net zero, whatever emissions exist in the atmosphere, barring the technology to remove them, will be there, and the impacts of those emissions will be there. And they'll be impacting British Columbians, Canadians, and citizens around the world. So we need to have concrete plans to begin cutting emissions and to do it in a staged and measurable way. So that's what the roadmap to 2030 is. It's a range of 8 different pathways with a number of measures in each pathway. In some cases, they're going to result in regulation. In some cases, they'll result in binding targets for instance, construction of new buildings. In other cases, it'll be an iterative process where we find one aspect of a pathway works a bit better, and we focus harder on that because we're achieving greater emissions for less cost and less impact on the public and the economy. So it's meant to be firm, but it's also meant to be firmly flexible in a way that doesn't lock in to something from today that we find out in 5 years isn't the best solution. So as I mentioned, we've expanded, we've accelerated our targets. We're transforming our public transit fleets, and both Translink and BC Transit have dates by which they intend to hit complete zero, both in the actual vehicles and in their operations. But we also need to focus on changing how people travel. So part of that is getting people used to public transit. Part of it is making transit safer, efficient, and more affordable. And that's one of the many reasons why we think of the Clean BC plan as a cross-government initiative. It's not simply my ministry developing policy and then urging people to follow through. It's an integrated plan across government to ensure that the Ministry of Transportation or different transit agencies are designing their programs and their planning and their measures to all to add up to a healthy economy that continually reduces our emissions. So we need to improve infrastructure, for instance, to make it easier for people to access transit, and also to use other forms of active transportation. So we're working on that collaboratively with BC Transit and with Translink and the Ministry of Transportation to ensure that all of our infrastructure plans incorporate plans for increased walking, rolling, and cycling. So the roadmap has ambitious goals for shifting from vehicles to active transportation and transit, 30% by 2030, 40 by 2040, and 50% by 2050, and that's immeasurable. We also aim to reduce the distances traveled in light-duty vehicles, what are commonly called single occupancy vehicles, by 25% by 2030 compared to 2020. And in large part, we're going to do that through increased use of active transportation and public transit, which can only happen if these modes are made inviting. So that's supported by an active transportation strategy called Move, Commute, Connect, as well as Translink's regional transportation strategy, Transport 2050, and which our government participated while it was being developed. You asked about accountability, so I'll simply close by saying in 2019, we introduced amendments to the Climate Change Accountability Act and renamed the Act, and we brought in a number of measures that were meant to hold not just our government, but all governments to account. Every year, our government is required by law to submit a report to the legislature that outlines our progress compared to what we said we were planning to achieve the previous year and accounted for in the budgets, as well as to lay out what we intend to do in the following year. And that's an iterative and a reiterative process of saying what we're going to do to meet our targets and then how we did in our progress towards that, as well as the spending of money to achieve those goals. We also include our achievements in each sector, including transit. And finally, we have the commentary and advice from the Independent Climate Solutions Council on climate action, on clean economic growth, on how they believe that government is doing and meeting our commitments and our plans, and what they think needs to be done to make the plans better. All of these support a climate action approach that should drive down emissions. We plan on it driving down emissions. It increases economic opportunities, and it is transparent to the people of BC.
Minister, if I can ask you, maybe, I know you said you'd close on the accountability measures as you did, but I'm going to ask you, maybe if we can close on a personal note, what are British Columbians saying to you about all of this? Because policy is so exciting to policy wonks like us, but the reality is, you know, British Columbians have lived through 2 really bad years. And I'm Albertan, so in the summer I've been going out to Calgary, and the sky is deadly polluted. You can't go outside. The forest is on fire. And if it's not on fire, it's flooded, and people are drowning or swimming away from their homes. You know, it's horrible. What British Columbians have lived through has been horrible. And there's no sign that it's going to get better because, as you said, the pollution's in the atmosphere. It's going to take targeted effort. We have to basically do everything just to mitigate. So what are people saying to you about the policy talk and what it actually means for British Columbians staying in British Columbia and not fleeing out of fear that their home is unsustainable any longer?
Well, the question, of course, for everyone is, where do you flee? We expect Canada and British Columbia specifically to be a destination for climate refugees, and we have to be prepared for that. It is actually quite tragic that people will be relocating, forced relocating for any reason, whether it's war or whether it's the impacts of climate change. I know in British Columbia, even more than elsewhere in Canada, concern about climate change tops virtually every public opinion poll. It comes within the top 3. Occasionally, health or some other factor may push it to 2 or 3, but it is always up there consistently, and that is a very significant change. So what British Columbians say is, what are we going to do to help them withstand any future heat domes, any future flooding? Are we going to rebuild infrastructure? Are we going to make communities safer? Are we going to help them invest in buildings that both cool effectively as well as heat effectively? That's what's on people's minds. So preparedness and adaptation is a big part, and they don't want us to just do things the way we always did them. They want to ensure that it's resilient and we plan for a changing climate future. And that's a big part of changes to our emergency management system, as well as our climate preparedness and adaptation strategy, particularly in getting the data and climate information and forecasting information we need to make good decisions. But I think let's use for example, electric vehicles in public transit. People want accessible, usable, affordable public transit. People who expect to be driving a vehicle. I think the last poll I saw was over 80% of British Columbians were going to consider an electric vehicle as their next car. Now, partly that's driven by the spike in gas prices that we've seen with the Russian war on Ukraine. But I think people are already heading that direction. People want governments to take action on climate change. They are, of course, always concerned about negative impacts on the economy or impacts that don't constitute a smooth transition that includes training for people in existing jobs and training of their kids, our kids, for the jobs of the future. I mean, it is very difficult to think beyond tomorrow if you don't have the ability to put food on the table and keep a roof over our heads. But having said that, people do believe that the two can go together, and they expect government to find a way to take action on climate, action on reducing emissions, and build a strong, diversified economy that is climate friendly. And I think it's a challenge for us to communicate. I often find when I talk to British Columbians, particularly during an election campaign, that they're simply unaware of the many steps we've taken and measures we've put in place. So we need to do a better job of communicating. I think the media needs to help us with that by focusing on both positive measures as well as the negative impacts we're experiencing. But the focus and attention, particularly in times of extreme weather events, is definitely there. And while there are always some people who are just think there's a disconnect between what we're experiencing and what we're doing in our economy and our communities to add to climate pollution, I think that number has shrunk dramatically.
Mm-hmm. Well, I have an 11-year-old nephew, and he once said to me, I only like talking about climate change with you because at least you're trying to solve the problem. And I think it's a pretty good example of exactly what you're referring to is people want to hear solutions because this is their livelihoods. And you're quite right. Canada is going to be a destination location for every kind of migration and refugee in the world, a lot of it climate refugees. So we need to prepare ourselves for that kind of situation. To that effect, I'm going to ask a little bit about the technologies around hydrogen and the possibilities of hydrogen in British Columbia. Trying to get to zero emissions is complicated, takes all kinds of solution sets. Historically, as we know, the BC Whistler trial was a very interesting and very important technological trial in British Columbia, but it didn't last and those buses were decommissioned. Now, fast forward to where we are today, we've been pushing forward a project in Mississauga, and there's a few other agencies in Canada now looking at hydrogen fuel cell technology because of the range, because of the technology as a zero emission solution. Can you walk us through what is BC's role now in the relaunch of a hydrogen fuel cell bus technology deployment in the project? In the province, and what is the space for hydrogen fuel cell buses as an economy in the province that actually created them in the first instance for Canada?
Well, as you point out, Ballard Power is a longstanding BC-based innovator in the hydrogen sector. It's serving a global market, and of course, we wanted to serve the British Columbia market as well. Last summer, our government, through the Ministry of Energy, Mines and Low Carbon Innovation, released our BC Hydrogen Strategy, and I think we're the first province to put forward concrete actions to transition to hydrogen. We have in our budget this year, just released $125 million for clean transportation investments, including hydrogen refueling station infrastructure. And that's in addition to $10 million that was provided in 2020 for 10 hydrogen fueling stations, as well as 3 years of support for Hydrogen BC. So it takes time to establish a new clean transportation technology, but we very much believe that hydrogen will be an important part of the low carbon future. And our province supports Translink's low carbon fleet and climate action strategies, which include both battery electric technology, which was found to be the most effective and cost-effective approach for most routes. But we also believe that hydrogen, and so do our transit corporations, that fuel cell buses are a significant potential option for replacing larger highway coaches in the longer term, as of course it will be for trucking and transportation. So we're continuing to work closely with Translink on the implementation of hydrogen strategies as well as battery electric strategies. We also think there's tremendous opportunity for production of green hydrogen in British Columbia, both for use internally and potentially for export.
Minister, maybe if I were to paint the final question from the outside looking in, British Columbia looks like it's perfectly set up to move to zero emissions and that there's really no obstacles left. And if I were to explain why, it's because two great innovative transit systems in Translink and BC Transit, vertically integrated, they have a central ministerial set of people they report to. So a lot of decision making. Cities that have passed climate action emergency declarations. BC Hydro produces clean green energy, left, right, and center, and you have a local ecosystem. Combine the federal funding for zero emissions transit with the commitments your province has made, it seems like there's no problems left to get to zero emissions. So can you walk us through in a concluding set of comments, are there any more challenges left, or is the pathway finally set and massive transformations about to unfold? And if there are any last residual issues and challenges, what are they? How do we overcome them?
Well, the pathways are set, but it's not just about transportation. It's about buildings and communities. It's about industry, and it's about transitioning in a thoughtful, measured, sustainable, and just way in terms of the fossil fuel industry. If we just focus on transportation, we've seen tremendous shifts over the past few years. When we released our plan in 2018, our target was 10% of new car sales being zero emission by 2025. Last year, 2021, we hit 13%. So we reset the targets. And we have a commitment to rising to 90% by 2030. In comparison, the US recently pledged that all electric vehicles will reach 40 to 50% of all sales by 2030. So on the one hand, it's great to be a leader in North America. On the other hand, it's going to be hard to reach this target if there isn't a production of electric vehicles to meet the demand. And what we've seen in the last year or two, it's a combination of increased appetite and demand for electric vehicles, supply chain problems, problems with chips and battery technology, and production not keeping up with the pace of change we need. But there's many people in British Columbia who are ready to make the switch now and can't get a vehicle. So that's a problem. But it's the right problem to have, because if we can gear up production, we can make the transition smoother. In terms of public transit, I think Translink and BC Transit's plans are to decarbonize their fleets by 2040. This is supported by the Canadian government's commitment. We need to continue to work to build out the system and support the transition of the bus system. And of course, that takes money and investment by governments, which I don't raise as an obstacle. I raise it as a practical reality. So we need to continue to ensure that we build out the infrastructure to support zero emission transportation, whether it's public or individual. And finally, I would say, I know that our trial, Translink's trial with QTRIC, is going to provide critical information on interoperability, and that's going to influence the design of the transit system going forward. And I guess the last obstacle we're working hard to address is the decline in ridership that occurred as part of the pandemic. We've seen ridership come back quickly now in the last couple of months, and it's projected, I hope this projection holds, to reach as high as 80% in the fall. But we need to get people back in public transit. We need people to feel secure in public transit. And if we can't achieve that, we're going to continue to have shortfalls that the federal and provincial government are going to have to step in to meet, when frankly, we'd rather be working together and ensuring we have the fare base that supports the kind of extensions of public and rapid transit that we know we need around the province as well as around the world. So there are obstacles. There's always going to be obstacles, and the great challenge and part of the fun of life, I think, is to figure out ways to meet those challenges.
And have the consistent, undeterred determination to make it happen, which you clearly have. And I really want to thank you again, not just for your time, but for your government's action in this space. Because while we do talk about government investment, at the end of the day, I mean, governments only invest what taxpayers tell them to invest in. So as Canadians, we hold the power to determine ultimately what our governments invest in for us. I will say, if there's a silver lining to the cloud of the pandemic, and there aren't many, but one is certainly in the transit industry, it did give a lot of our transit agencies the time they needed and the space without the ridership demand to plan for all this complex stuff. So hopefully when we come roaring back with ridership at full capacity in the next few months, we'll also come roaring back with newly electrified powertrains that we had the time to plan out. So thank you so much again, Mr. Heyman, for your time. Stay safe and stay healthy, and we're looking forward to seeing you again in a few months' time at our next conference.
Great. Thank you very much. Have a great conference. And I would say one other silver lining of the pandemic is, for most people anyway, it showed that we're stronger together and that we need to rely on each other, and that government has an important role in supplying and providing the infrastructure that supports our communities.
Truly so, in the interest of humanity. Excellent words to end on. Thank you so much, Minister.
Thank you.
Well, what a day. I think that was a great closing to hear from Minister George Heyman. He has been such a champion of Cutrix over the past few years. Being able to meet with him, work with his team, it's been fantastic. And also just seeing how far along British Columbia is in the electrification journey. We heard from Kim Gergelis from BC Hydro earlier. Yesterday, I think that was now. But just a really, really great to see such an innovative province pushing electrification forward. So with that, I do want to welcome you to our closing. Thank you so much for joining us for our final session. I mentioned it this morning, but I honestly feel like this has been the most jam-packed conference we've had to date, if that's possible, with a virtual conference, a federal funding announcement, a zero-emission bus consulting service product launch, an in-person networking dinner last night, 45 speakers, just over 2 days, 15 panels, 8 keynote sessions, sponsor exhibits. It has been a busy one, that's for sure. And we're just so thrilled to have over 500 participants on the line. So thank you. Without you, we wouldn't be able to make this happen. So I've heard from some of our attendees over the past couple of days who are just so impressed with our speakers and the dialogues that we've managed to foster throughout the conference. Today, we kick things off with welcoming remarks from Hydrogen Champion Mayor of Mississauga, Bonnie Crombie, an overview of Ontario's transportation priorities from Minister of Transportation Caroline Mulroney. And we also had Associate Minister Stan Cho last night provide in-person keynote remarks, which were fantastic. If you weren't able to join the in-person event last night, they will be online coming up next week. So stay tuned for that to hear what he had to say as well. This morning, I also led a panel on innovative charging solutions with eCamion, S2E, Init, Equicharge, and Hitachi Energy. It was a busy one. My colleague Salmia led the conversation on renewable natural gas, engaging with the champions Hamilton Street Railway, Enbridge, and Fortis BC. We also heard from academics' points of views of zero-emission transit from the University of Toronto. And we had a keynote speech with past director Ben Case, who is with the Toronto Transit Commission. That was a really insightful conversation. Battery electric buses, hydrogen fuel cell electric buses, autonomous buses, electric school buses. We dove deep into all of these technologies with industry experts. So we just can't thank our speakers enough for taking the time today and yesterday to honor us with their grace. So it was amazing. Lastly, as you've just heard, we heard from Alberta's Minister of Transportation, Rajan Soni, whose community equity lens really shapes her decision-making role, or her decision-making in the role of Minister of Transportation. And then, as you've just heard, we heard from Minister Heyman, who really is just such a champion, walking us through BC's updated roadmap to 2030. I think it's very exciting and promising from a government relations standpoint just to see how active their ministry is and their government overall.
Merci beaucoup, Grace. Bonjour tout le monde. Merci d'avoir répondu présent à la 2e édition annuelle de la Conférence canadienne sur les technologies et l'exploitation du transport en commun en autobus à zéro émission. Ma collègue Grace l'a mentionné ce matin, mais nous pensons honnêtement que cette conférence a été la plus chargée que nous avons eue à ce jour. Une annonce de financement provenant du fédéral, un lancement de produits par nos services de consultation, un souper de réseautage en personne, 45 conférenciers en 2 jours dans 15 panels de discussion, puis 8 conférences d'honneur. Effectivement, nous venons de passer à travers 2 journées bien chargées. Nous sommes ravis d'avoir partagé ces 2 belles journées avec vous. Puis c'est pas rien car vous êtes plus de 500 personnes.
And I'm just waiting for the fire truck to pass. Apologies if you heard that. So you might all be wondering who the brains are behind this somewhat seamless symphony. I want to introduce you to my colleague, Melissa Haynes, who has worked absolutely tirelessly on managing the event. Her talents have really shown through the past few days. A virtual conference, easy. Was that enough? No. So we had an in-person networking conference. There we go. That's enough. That's the show we want to put on. Melissa has organized everything from event management to sponsors to speaker coordination. Melissa, thank you so much for your efforts and for your organization of the Kutrick team. I'm honestly not sure how you did it and really not sure how we've pulled this off together, another successful event. So I want to pass the virtual microphone over to you to say a few words.
Thanks, Grace, so much for those kind words. And I can definitely assure you that there's no ways I would have been able to do it without you and the rest of the Kutrick team. So yeah, thanks so much for all your help during that time. I would also like to, of course, say a huge thank you to all of our speakers who joined us and our attendees who joined us over the past 2 days. Of course, we wouldn't have an event if it wasn't for you. So thank you so much for that. We had a huge jam-packed agenda, loads of content, and I'm hoping that everybody who attended over the past 2 days has learned something new and that you feel inspired to help Canada meet its net zero by 2050 goals through a greener, cleaner transit innovation. Of course, this conference would not have been possible without our valuable sponsors. I would like to once again thank ABB, NFI Group, Demera Bus Group, HDR, Ricardo Rail, ZEB Clean Power, Hitachi Energy, Nova Bus, Ballard, Siemens, Init, and Microgreen Solar. We appreciate your loyal support, and most of you have sponsored a few of our conferences before, so we're really grateful for your support. Last but not least, I would like to thank my colleagues and team of Kutrick for your support in putting together such a great event for our participants. Special thanks to you, Grace, Magali, and Hafsa, our moderators, Titash, Conrad, Mariev, Zahara, Salmia, and of course, Josipa. And our speakers, Parvati Pillai and Roberta Sardenberg. You have all been so amazing through this process, and there's no ways I would have been able to do it without you. So thank you all so much. I'd also like to thank a special thanks to our external moderators who led some of our panels. We had Michelle Jones from TTC, we had Stephanie Lefebvre from ABB, Karen Cameron from Opta, Aaron Cook from Winnipeg Transit, and Himanshu Siddhan from eCamion. We really appreciate your participation and your support. And those were great panels. I'm sure all of our participants will agree, the exciting content and the great job that you did moderating those panels. So thank you very much for that. And of course, we just finished one conference and now we are on to our next one. We'll be hosting our 4th annual Low Carbon Smart Mobility Conference on June 21st and 22nd virtually. We have opened up some super early access tickets that are available until April the 15th. You can go ahead and register with the link that we are dropping into the chat right now. And you can sign up for updates on there to keep up to date with speakers and new agenda items as they come up. So yeah, we hope to see you all there.
Merci, Melissa. Merci à nos commanditaires platine, ABB, New Flyers, MCI, Alexander Dennis, Arbach et NFI Parts, à nos commanditaires or, Ballard, ZEB Clean Power, Ricardo et HDR, à nos commanditaires argent, Hitachi Energy et Nova Bus, et à nos commanditaires bronze, Siemens et Init. Merci beaucoup.
Well, that's our Zero Emission Bus Technologies Conference over for another year. Thank you once again for joining us today. I've said it before, we don't do anything by halves here at Kutrick, and we are always striving to be better. So with that, we look forward to your feedback, and we will see you next year for another passionate, robust, and engaging conference. Take care, everybody.